Welcome back. Hopefully everyone had a nice, refreshing tea break and a lovely morning. We're going to kick off our afternoon with another trauma healing testimony, and this one is from Ukraine. So I'm going to invite up Victoria Raychinets. She is the trauma healing program manager for Bible Society of Ukraine. She is one of 2 master facilitators in Ukraine. She's helping lead trauma healing ministry within churches, military settings, and soon-to-be seminaries and ministries with children's trauma healing. While she's not doing this, she's actually keeping 2 of her own humans alive, which, even though it's not on a resume, it's really hard work. It's the hardest work one can do most of the time. And I just found out last night she is a painter, so you can ask her about that. It's pretty awesome. So if you want a beautiful gift, make friends with her, and she may paint you something beautiful. So please welcome with me Victoria Raychinets.
Thank you so much. On the rights of commercial, I sell those paintings, by the way. So come talk to me later. It was a joke. I don't sell because I don't have a time to do that. But if I would have a time for doing this, I would sell it. Anyway, today, what do I have to do to start to the right? Okay. Today, I'm gonna be talking about my country. I am from Ukraine. I was born there and grew up and like my country and the city I grew up in Kyiv, but our country has an interesting story behind all these years. I called it Ukraine Not Easy Times. And if you look to the history of our country, it seems like we never had an easy times until these days. And we had Holocaust, hunger. In Russian language, it's very close words, so I always mix up them. We had hungers, we had genocides, we had wars, and it seems like throughout the years, somebody always wanted to destroy our nation. And it brought to some obvious results. First of all, it made our nation stronger. It seems like we can survive no matter what. It seems like nothing can destroy us because we can always find a way how to move on, how to find light in the darkness. The second is we became more patient. But it's interesting that we didn't become patient to one another. We became patient to the circumstances we live in. And we became patient to the life we have. We are not ready to fight for something because basically we don't trust something is going to change until these days. We don't trust if we'll have a new government that something will be changed. And you know why we don't trust? Because it will never really be changed. So this kind of life brought us to be patient to the circumstances we are. And the last thing is that it seems like the whole nation is used to become a victim. And it's in all ways of our lives. And this also maybe became worse even with this sign that you have here. You all know what it is. But this sign was also a little bit good that made to our country is that it united us to many other countries that was in the Soviet Union. And this Soviet Union, it kept our country for 70 years in communism. And 70 years, it's a long time of being without God, of being in a very strict regime, the regime that showed never compassion, that gave no freedom. As a result, we had a lot of poverty in our country, and the most interesting is until this day, we have such a poverty in the middle of Europe. And at the same time, the most richest the richest people in the world, they are also in Ukraine. So this gap in between very rich people and very poor people, this is our country. Helplessness, a huge number of alcoholism, of course, it's connected to poverty and helplessness. And the most scary part about this is all this caused not just trauma, but a big, long generational trauma. It's domestic abuse. It's every other family in our country is facing domestic abuse, addictions, children's trauma. And the most scary about this is that in our society, we think that this is our personal. We would never go and talk about this, share with someone, and children that grow up in our family grow up with understanding that this is normal. I'm fine. Nothing strange is happening to me. I grow up in a family and I move to the adult world and think that there is, if something is connected to trauma, it's not about me. There is nothing bad happened to me because everything that is in the family, it's all personal business of each family. The other thing that Soviet Union made to us as a Christians is Soviet Union put us into a really big conservatism. We became a very, very closed up people. As nation, first of all, we don't trust anybody. And secondly, as a Christians, we also don't trust anybody. And that's why when we started facing trauma, we basically don't know what to do with this. We don't know how to be a respond. And even when we think about respond, we know the only respond is God, which is true. We all know God is our answer. But sometimes we don't know how to bring people to the really healing salvation, not just to bring them to God, but how to help them to go through this pain and their journey of grieving. So that's why trauma healing became a really good answer for our country. We finally started trauma healing in 2016, and we have led already 8 sessions where we covered around 300 ministers from all denominations. By the way, it's 18 denominations that Bible Society could unite, which is impossible actually. None other organizations in our country can unite in themselves all of the denomination, not a single one except Bible Society. So all the 18 denominations, official of course, denominations that we have in our country, they all participate in trauma healing trainings and leading healing groups. And it's all pastor, priests, deacons, child's ministry. You see Catholic priest, very exciting, happy man. And God has blessed our country with this program because we see this as an answer to us. But war. You all know that recently Ukraine is being under the war, and I have heard from somebody that it's been called a civil war, so I can say it's not a civil war. And for us Ukrainians, this is very important, guys. Don't call it a civil war because we're not facing a civil war. We are not fighting with each other. Unfortunately, we are fighting against someone, and you never expect war. The problem is that war comes always unexpected, and it always brings a lot of results. It always brings a lot of pain, It always brings a lot of trauma. And the most horrible about this, that the war brings results for years, years, and years. And even if the war will be finished, we know that we'll be working with trauma for years. And at this point, war in Ukraine is already for almost 5 years. And sometimes people that are on the other parts of Ukraine where war is not happening, sometimes they get sick of this and tired of this and don't want to talk about this. But when you go there, you understand that it's so realistic. And people there, this is the place where I could look at people's eyes and see such helplessness, hopelessness, 100% hopelessness, and 100% hope. Hoping. No trust in God because God betrayed them and left them. And at the same time, 100% trust on God because there is nothing else they could be trusting in right there. So we started this program, trauma healing program, and we had already 2 sessions for chaplains that go there to the front lines to spend time there with soldiers that come that get to the hospitals, come back as a combat, and it's been successful. It's just a start, but we already have a lot of results. And here I have a story. I don't have his name and his picture because he didn't want it to be named. So that's an interesting story. This is a story of a young man named Sergey, and he is 23 at this time. By this time, he was in a war zone for 2 years already. The priest that was talking to him, the one who took trauma healing and then went back home to practice healing groups, he met this guy in the hospital. He lost his 2 legs, so he will never be able to walk, and his right hand will never be able to move. He has it, but it's never be able to move anymore. The time when he faced him at the hospital was not nice view of this guy. I mean, he looked horrible. And when priest started talking to him, this guy, Sergey, asked him one question. He said, "Please help me to find a way how I can forgive." And the priest looked at him, "Well, what do you need to forgive?" And he started talking to him. He wanted to ask as much of questions to help him to tell him his story, because obviously you look at him and you see there is a reasons to forgive. And this boy said, I cannot forgive my mom. And this boy who was in the war for 2 years, who is totally destroyed, who has totally destroyed body, he's asking a question, how can I forgive my mom, who left him when he was 14? And as this priest says, praise God, by that time I have accomplished trauma healing session. And I knew how to talk to him. And that story finished with the words of Sergey, "Thank you so much. Right now I can forgive my mother." And this is a good story of forgiveness, but it shows us so much that these people that are there in the war zone, sometimes we think that the only trauma that they have is from the horror of the war. Of course, this happens, and it never leaves their minds and hearts. What they see, the pain and blood and shooting in the war, it will never go away from their lives, and it will stay for all their lives. But sometimes the deeper pain can be much, much earlier. And that's why we understand that we have to work with these people even more closely than we regularly work with people. And at this time, I can say that we're just starting trauma healing in military area. We had some successes in trauma healing with adults, and we are starting with children this year. But military people is very special people. They have such a combination of their traumas and results, adding all the time, connected with addiction farther on. Almost every second person that had been in the war finishes up with alcoholism in our country. I don't know how it is in the States, but in our country. So alcoholism becomes a part of the military guys, actually. And we're just starting this ministry, but we already see this big need because it's 1,000 people who live, civil people just who live there in a war zone or in the occupied territories. They face a lot of issues with destroyed homes, with destroyed lives, with destroyed relationships, families. We have a lot of people, soldiers that live there or in the other parts of Ukraine, their families. If someone is losing someone in the family, I personally work with non-believers, young people who lost someone in their families, and this field is huge. Volunteers that always go there and just spend time there in the gray zones, in the war zones, it's missionaries, it's medical workers, it's chaplains. The field is just huge. And I know that to do trauma healing in this sphere is difficult, is risky. It's almost like on the war, with the same attacks, with the same fields of mines. And to build trauma healing for military right now, as I feel, is like to walk on this mind field, which every step you make can be dangerous. So that's why we ask you very much to pray for us as we do this journey. We just know that the need is growing every day in all these spheres. And what I'm able to share with you is just this little bit because I didn't have more time allowed it. But at least even with this time, I just would like you guys to ask you to pray and support us with the prayer, because we understand that we are in this filled with minds. May God bless you.
I happen to be the sous chef for the Reverend Guyton, who will come in and deliver the meal. And I like being her sous chef. She has a good meal for us to take. We have been hearing a lot about generational trauma. And we have been thinking about them in so many different contexts. Just today, 20 generations in the Navajo people. 5 generations in Dr. Lyle's family. And that's just a little tidbit, right? We heard yesterday about 2/3 of those released from jails and prisons will be ending back up in prison again. We've heard many different contexts. Carolyn Custis James talked to us about generational trauma in women in the church, right? So we have lots of these challenges that we've put before us, and we feel very heavy from it, right? It feels impossible. It feels too much, right? And so it would be easy for us to go relax, have a cup of tea, think about something else, and we should do that soon. But we don't want to do that before we close this, right? And we really think about, where are we going? What can we do so that we ourselves don't lose hope? right? So we've asked this question, what is generational trauma? And hopefully you caught that it can be something that is directly transmitted, you know, from an alcoholic parent to a child, who in turn transmits it. It can be transmitted biologically, an alcoholic mother who then brings fetal alcohol syndrome to her child, right? And the child experiences that biologically. We saw it can happen in other ways as well. So within the family, within systems. Where does it exist? It exists everywhere, right? Anywhere that there are people, anywhere that there is broken people, and anywhere there are broken systems. And one of the questions about transmission that we highlighted on the first day is that transmission is often through systems and structures that maintain a power, an abuse of power that allows it to continue, that allows identities to be shaped for generations upon generations, right? In this room, the very fact, the mere fact that you are in this room suggests to me that you are of a more privileged caste than most others in the world. Now, in this room, we have different power structures, right? And we have different levels of power. But many of you flew here. You were in taxis. You have been able to stay in hotels. Very few in the world get this opportunity. So we do have to ask this question: what role have we played in its continuance? Right? So these are the deep questions that we're asking, that we are trying not to turn away from. So what can we do? Again, I'm the sous chef. I'm just giving you a couple of little ideas, but keep these three things in mind. We can choose to see. We can choose to embrace the uncomfortable feelings that we've been having over the last 3 days. Some of us have expressed that we feel shame. We feel guilt because maybe we participated, however distantly, or our ancestors did. Some of us saw things that we had nothing to do with, but now we have them in our head. And it would be easier again to forget. But we can choose to embrace, right? And hang on to those uncomfortable feelings, especially when they are in our communities, and they might in fact shape how we function tomorrow. And of course, then there's some action. So let me just give you a couple of ideas. What can we choose to see? If you have had any time in the healing wounds of trauma, you know that lament is one of our most powerful activities that we do in our lessons, right? After lesson 3, in the grief lesson, we often give people time to lament and help them understand it. Can we not lament together what we have seen? By lamenting it, you are naming it. You are refusing to let it die on your lips. You are saying it out loud. And you are encouraging, because lament is a corporate activity, you are encouraging your brothers and sisters to also lament, to name it by its right name. You see, God in the creative acts in Genesis 1 and 2, he gives Adam the privilege to name things as they are, to name the animals as they are. Part of the fall is that we started giving false names for things. And we've discussed this here before in previous years. I can call it love when it's really abuse, right? I can call it leadership when it's really abuse of power. So part of our lamenting is giving things their right name, however ugly they might be. Empathy is part of this. Observance. Corporate repentance, right? We can do these things. We can sit with these uncomfortable feelings. This means that when somebody raises something, we don't just ignore it. Dr. Lyles said that one of the hardest things to talk about in this country is race. In your context, maybe there's something else that's really, really hard to talk about. Embracing those feelings means also being able to ask questions about it. And of course, there are actions. It's no good just to see and name and wring our hands and to do nothing. And oftentimes we feel like there is nothing that we can do because we can't disrupt a system. We're just one person. We can't disrupt anything. but we can. And I'm going to give you actually one way that you can do something, and Dr. Lyles touched on this as well. You can start by having conversations and understanding the strengths of the person who is sitting across from you. Too often, we who are in the world of trauma healing, we look at the world and we see what's broken. We name those things, and we want to see justice come, we want to see healing. But we often just see people we label as victims. Yet they have much in their lives that are strengths, things that they are proud of, things that they give them courage. Do you know those stories as well? Have you sat with somebody who's different from you and asked them, so tell me, what is your family proud about? What traditions in your family do you wish my family might adopt? These are some basic questions that have nothing to do with trauma and everything to understanding the person who's there. This is an action that says, you are human. You are human too. So, this is a three-step thing that you can be thinking about. We're going to give you now a couple of stories, and I'll start, and then Desiree will be coming up as well. These stories are examples where some of these things had to be followed. The first one comes from my own school. You'll know that I have been a professor for many years at Biblical Theological Seminary, and a number of years ago, some of our leadership formed a new degree program called the Urban Master of Divinity. And it was a cohort-based program, and surprising to them, it took off and was going extremely well from the leadership's perspective. It was either 3 or 4 year program, I think 4, and in the 3rd year of the 4th year, a few students came and said, we love this program, but we'd like to talk to you. I got to listen in and observe some of the conversations, and what was said was hard. The syllabus, the books, the teachers you have, they don't represent minority voices. They don't represent urban voices. We love the Bible, we love biblical seminary, but something's missing. Would you be willing to listen to us? And our president at that time, not Carolyn Custis James' husband, but the previous president said, let's have lunch. Let's sit down, let's talk, tell us what's wrong. So there are probably many things that we as a seminary did wrong, but one of the things I'm proud about was there was a willingness to hear and understand what can we change. Several in that cohort became actually the next professors and the next leaders of this organization. The syllabi changed. The faculty who were teaching had to change and read different books and add different things. So there was a willingness to see, a willingness to lament, and a willingness to give up some power, which is one of the hardest things to do, and why Acts 6 is such a tremendous biblical story where we have a power differential and we have people who say, no, we're not going to just hold on to this and decide ourselves. Choose amongst yourselves people of good reputation who will decide and solve this problem. So one example here. Des will come and give us another.
Thank you, Phil. As Phil clearly so graciously articulated, there are many ways that we can see, embrace, and act. And so I promise you at the end that I will share one, but in order to share the full story, I needed to share some things that might be a little difficult for a short period of time, because I think Dr. Lyles did such a fantastic job. But for you to get to aha, I need to kind of do a little bit more backdrop. And I want to honor all the countries and all the people, you know, Carol, the Native American that shared so beautifully, you know, and empowered us, the Saudis, right? And Iran, all the countries that are here, we all work in this trauma field. And, you know, my story is only a piece to all these other stories. But what I hope you take from me and Dr. Lyle's story is that we all have power, and that in that power, I hope you see some systems that were built and some things that were done in America and to the African Americans and the Native Americans, that while you are coming through the trauma in your system, in your structure, in your country, maybe you may see this aha. Does that make sense? Maybe you can see this, oh, maybe, you know, what we talked about today, maybe we can not go through what African Americans or Native Americans go through from a structural or from a cultural. What ways can we see? What ways can we embrace? What ways can we communicate to our political leaders? What ways can we communicate to our churches? Because what I've learned in this process, and I had to open up new wounds in entering generational trauma. So I left for a timeline. This is a brief one. The one that Harriet got was about 6 pages. It's a brief one. And I'm not going to go through the timeline, but what I want you to understand, for some of you, that you have to, there's myths, there's a miseducation, there's a mishistory, there's things that are missing in order for you to kind of put some pieces together. And of course, like I said, it's African American history, but it's 400 to 500 years. It's important for you to see where the church missed its opportunities, and where the church and where structures and things and organizations that you're a part of now could have interrupted some of the trauma. Are you with me? Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole trauma timeline, but I need you to first understand that chattel slavery was a unique type of slavery. It was a buying and a selling of a people that you deemed as not being human. And that was not a political decision. It was a church decision. Denominations got together and said, we did not have a soul. And during the Great Awakening, throughout the Great Awakening, we began to have 1/5 of a soul. We began to have 2/5 of a soul, 3/5 of a soul. This was not just a political decision. It was a political decision that was also bred within the church in order to justify, in order to continue what was happening to Africans, because that's what it were. They were Africans who were then beaten to lose your name, totally not allowed to have, and a lot of, I mean, some stories we've heard of marriages, but in overall, we're not allowed to have a family. If you did have a family, your children were property. So they were sold and sent to another plantation. The brutality and the ability to treat us as not human was bred, and it was flamed by the church. The church made decisions, and the church began to apologize starting in 1970. Our churches were split by North and South. You have the Northern Lutheran and Southern, not just over civil rights. It was split over this concept of the soul. So I just wanted to give that backdrop, because while some of the countries I hear what's going on, as you begin to heal and begin to frame, I hope that as leaders and people you see, does that make sense? That you embrace and that you act. So in order to do that, I need to tell you, my mom, we gave her a computer after retirement, and Lord, did she make a whole world. My mother is here. I snuck her in. And I tell you, like I said, this is hope. I'm not here to give you a Dr. Lyons deep story of my history, but you got to understand, most African Americans have no clue of their history. So my mother, about 20 years ago, did research, and she found our plantation. She knew she was from Darlington area. She grew up in segregation, in the Jim Crow, in the South. And Roseville Plantation was restored by a historian. So we had the privilege of driving and going to see it. I didn't want to do it. I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't want to know my history. I didn't want to care. I was a descendant. I didn't really want to know. But I tell you, when I hit that plantation, tears flowed. To see the slave shacks on the left, tears flowed. My mom, in the meantime, this is her cousin, white cousin, that is to the left. I'm going to forget her name, and I apologize. I don't feel like looking for it. And my mom saved the cemetery, the slave cemetery and the white cemetery, and made it a historical area. So therefore, I think it was Toyota or Honda wanted to build a factory, so they saved the land so the factory was not built. Now, why this is important is my mom found and discovered my great-great-grandmother who was a slave. Her name was Minerva Cato Brockington Bacot. My mom's ancestors, her name is Holmes Bacot. And so on my mother's side, my mother's grandmother she was a slave. But this slave was married to the son of the slave owner. Now, of course, when I say married, what does that mean? The names he claimed his children in the Bible, which was not normal, but this was also towards the end of Reconstruction. And so there is, understanding that for when Reconstruction hit, it was wise for him to claim his children, because then you can still have people work the land. So we don't know if it's a true love story or not, but the historians or people that I talked to said it most likely was in order to keep his children and on the land. Now, the uniqueness of this story too, because this comes to the punchline, or why I'm standing here about generational trauma, is that Minerva husband, who was William Murphy Brockington, right? Am I correct, Mom? William Murphy Washington. I knew it was close. I should look at my notes. His family migrated from France in 1694, and they were the Huguenots. The Huguenots was largely Calvinist, and severe persecution at the hands of Catholic majority, and many thousands migrated from France into America. So once again, this Calvinist history of a background, who was a believer or would historically be, had an opportunity. This family had an opportunity, and this opportunity, they wind up owning slaves and continuing the structure within. Do you understand? Are you with me so far? So my grandmother, now there is a great-grandmother, but she died young, and we do not have a picture of her. But my grandmother, who is my mother's mother, was a sharecropper. So she was born in 1913, but she was sharecropping is another form of slavery, in the sense that you had your rights, but you were not paid to work. You didn't get the level of pay of working the fields. I'm not here to give a full history story, but I think what's important is my grandmother, when I got to know her, because I didn't really get to know her as a youth because she was an alcoholic and she could become violent at family dinners. And so she displayed a lot of trauma. Now I know when I look back. And then the story she would tell me when I would visit her during college years, she would cry every visit and talk about her child that died, and that she didn't get the money from the sharecropper that he owed her, and couldn't get to, and get to the medical care for the baby, the young child that died. My mom's was also born in the South, and she was born in segregation. And she tells a story of, looking at the white kids on the bus, and she had to walk. And so there's a difference. There's this trauma, and then they migrate to the North. And the migration to the North was, if you ever read anything about migration, it was a tough time for families. So I'm not going to go through the whole history, but my grandmother displayed that trauma. Okay, and she and trust me, we didn't family dinners, it would blow up when grandma was around. So, but that trauma of slavery was passed down. Now, before I get to this story, the reason I want to just touch on this one part before I get to this slide. While I was working through this generational trauma and reading the book, The Soul of Shame. I'm really hesitant because I don't like the fact of saying this, but several traumatic events in my life to define, I had to realize the shame that I carried of being Black. When I was grew up in the 70s, I'm aging myself, my parents migrated out of Philadelphia to South Jersey. The story is my mom and dad had 10 children, but at the time it was about 6, if I'm correct. And they lived in poverty here in Philadelphia. And my oldest brother was 10 years old, and he stole something from the store. And he got the whole police interaction thing. And my mom said real quick, next thing she knew, they were out in the woods of South Jersey. Because he said, I will not raise my boys to go to jail. 1 out of 4 Black males are in jail by the age of 16. 80% of African-American children are raised by single-parent homes. That is not by accident. And that's not because we are a corrupt people with no morals. It is a system and a strategic structure that is built into our system. My mom and dad raised us out in the South, and South Jersey, which was a 90-something% Italian town. And my first encounter was I was 8 years old, and I played sports because I was raised with 7 brothers. And I couldn't wait. They started a girls' softball. I got out there, and when I went to go hit the ball, you know, I'm standing up there, father yells, I don't want my daughter playing with any niggers. I came to understand what that meant. A couple years later, my best friend, we rode horses together, we rode dirt bikes together, and she had a sleepover. I begged to go. My mom was like, no, you're not going. My dad, I kept begging, you know, I wore my dad down, and he says to my mother, let her go. She'll learn. I didn't know what that meant. I go to the house, I go to the sleepover, and wake up the next morning, we're having breakfast, and the father was away or something. He came in for breakfast, and he looked at me. He sat down, we all started to eat, and he slams the table and says, I vowed I would never have a nigger at my table. I had to go home. Those are just a few to shape what I'm gonna tell you one more because I think it's appropriate for age for just to know. My freshman year in college, I walk in, I'm the only Black. They stuck 3 people in a small room, and it was 2 white females, and they looked at me and said, we don't like niggers. This is in 1986. Christian college. I went to Messiah College, which was a Christian college. My expectations of that Christian college was I was not going to go through this at a Christian institution. Yet I experienced one of the greatest racism in an environment that I was not expecting. So shame, I hate to say, shapes me. And I would have to honestly say, even as I stand here, I battle it because of my hairstyle. I look at my calendar when I go to my hairdresser, and I will say, if I'm cool, I don't have no major speaking engagements, I don't have anything, might wear my hair more natural. But if I know I'm going to speak and I'm going to be in presence of white people, if I'm going to do certain things, I have my hair decision changed. That's not just here. Recently, I received an article about South Africa where 2 students were removed from their private school because they wore their hair natural. There was an article recently that we passed a law that it was okay for businesses to fire someone or not hire someone because they have dreadlocks. That's in the state of America. That's in America. This is the article. So the battle of what it means to be African American in America, Black in America, I lived this dual life. I went to a school that was predominantly white, and then I went to church that was all Black. I wasn't black enough for my church friends who were in the city, because I went to church in the city, but I wasn't white enough to be accepted. So that dual world, which W. Du Bois says, there's a dualness of the soul. There's 2 wars that battle. And as much as I don't like to talk about it, that war still presses me. The effects of being Black in America is one that one is shame, but the other is are faced the fact that harshness of our discipline. As a mom, you know, we're, as an African American, we as a culture are pretty harsh on our children. In the book of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, the author, I was shocked when I read it. I was like, that's me. I mean, she tells a story, and it happened to me recently. With all this knowledge, I'm in the bank, and the key, let me explain this before I tell this story, is this harshness says, our kids cannot act up in public. You represent more than just being African American. You represent the whole entire culture. But you got to understand the deepness of this. If you look on your timeline, you will understand that there was never, this pressure could never be off of us. If my mom did not obey her mother in the segregated South, it was life or death. That pressure was on the, it's the pressure of this is life or death if you don't act right in public. That pressure was passed down. My father was tied to a tree and whooped by his father. That is directly from slavery. So how did he keep his 7 boys out of jail? He half killed them. Not as bad as that, but he whooped us. It only took one for me. With the switch that cuts your legs. Only one for me. Now, my brothers, it took more. And they would tell you the dualness of that. They would say in one way, yeah, it was abuse, but another way, it kept me out of jail. Because it's a reality. I'll tell one more story before I talk about that bank scene. Is a teacher called me a nigger when I was 8th grade. I walked out of class and went to the vice principal, who was black. And, you know, because my parents always had, because I grew up in this school, all 10 brothers of us, they had direct access to my parents, okay? So I knew my parents were going to find out before I got home, but I didn't realize my dad would come out of work and meet me at school, at the bus. And I don't even know if my mom knows this story, but he meets me, and I'm scared to death. I get off this bus, and I'm scared to death because I know all he heard was I walked out of class. And he's like, what? And I said, Dad, listen, please, Dad, I'm begging. And he listens. I said, she called me a nigger. He put his face to my nose and said, you acted like a nigger the moment you walked out of that class. You are to take the knowledge of every white person, but you are never to walk away. Now you have to understand, he had to train me to understand that in this world you will face trouble, but you are to stand. And I'm not saying that we should accept this, but I'm trying to get you to see it was a systemic pressure that I still live with to this day. And so the harshness, or even when I'm in the bank, as much knowledge as I had, I went to the bank just this week, I had to go inside. I usually don't have to go in anymore. And this black mother struggling with their kids, and one's taking, and the white kid's running around the bank, and the black kid took off to run out of the bank and run around. And I stopped and I gave an eye to the little black kid. The war was in me, but I saw the mother struggling too, and I went, and he came over, I whispered in his ear, knock it off and go over there to your mom right now. Is that understood? And he looked at me, yes, and he ran over to his mom. And the mother gave me that black nod. As much knowledge, I'm like, no, he should be free. He should be able to run around that bank just like that white kid. As much knowledge, as much war. That's why I lived through the trauma. So trauma still maybe has its residue. It still filters. It still festers. It's still, as much as I don't want it to be. And I hope that you will see, for those in your own country, that once, even if some of the political situations may correct itself, and things that there is residues or there is things that are passed down generation to generation. And the reason why I gave this timeline is you got to understand something. Reconstruction period was 22 years. In those 22 years, African Americans held 1,500 positions in government. They were wiped out. In 1866, when the Ku Klux Klan was formed, after that, if you look on there, when Reconstruction ended, which was another opportunity for the church, it was another opportunity politically, there was things that was done backdoor. If you ever study what happened, Reconstruction, we never ever regained that until after Martin Luther King, almost 100 years later. 100 years. And it was 100 years of terror. Look at your list. Riot after riot after riot. Things were happening in this country, and it was up north too. This was not a southern thing, because once they realized the migration to the north meant a threat to jobs, it meant a threat to different things. The reason why Sunday mornings is segregated is not because blacks like music different than whites. It was not accepted. We were not accepted. And that's proof by Richard Allen and AME Church. Well, my point is this, though. The beauty of it is we serve a God who's bigger than all of this. We serve a God who understands all of this. We serve a God who does not just let us stay like this. So, the picture that you see, on a couple days before Martin Luther King, my mom and all her history and all her ties, and she gets an email from Dan, who's actually been emailing us for a couple years, my mom said. But Dan was very persistent of coming to visit us on Martin Luther King. Dan is a descendant of the slave owner on my grandfather's side. Am I correct, Mom? On my grandfather's side, which is the plantation a couple miles from the house, from the original plantation you saw. He is a descendant of a slave, but he was persistent in coming and intentional in coming to visit. Now, of course, I had a dialogue in my head, this white man coming from the South, come to visit me. Why would the white man want to come from the South and visit me and come visit our family? But it was a blessed time. Scott, throughout the years, has helped my mom. He's a genealogist with what's her finding and giving her the tools to teach her how to do the discovery of our history. They both came to our house, sat, break bread, and Dan wanted to stay the night. Dan heard us. Dan saw us. Dan made me feel more human. Dan and Scott talked about books they referred and talked about our history more than I knew. But to have two white men, now I've sat with women, but two white men to come and break bread in my home. Two white men to spend hours with us. Gave voice to what I could not articulate. Took away what I would feel as crazy. Respected our home. Generation trauma can be healed through us, people, taking the time to listen. Taking the time to come together. So I am glad that they saw us. They embraced the struggle of the feelings. Because think about it, what would his feeling of, I want to go to this house. I mean, he didn't know what he was going to. He was met with two of my brothers who are big at the door, and my one brother was making all kind of jokes that I didn't particularly care for, but he did not run. He stayed. He listened, and he embraced us. There's a term called cognitive dissonance. It means what we think, and the discourse, and there's a greater difference between our actions and what we think. It's the tension. And I see this often when people come and talk to me as an African American, and they don't know what to say, don't want to do, or what we've heard a few people stop and say, well, my family were slave owners, and they may carry the guilt. But I'm also hearing a lot of conversations of whites saying, aren't you tired of that? You know, you guys should have got over this. We gave our tax dollars. It's over. Why are you, now we're the new minority. My challenge to you is to fight through the cognitive dissonance. Fight through the shame you feel, because as an African American, as much as we may not want to admit to it, we are still walking in that shame. Fight through the rejection of the feelings that you may have. Fight the denial. And as I have to do much without dealing with my own anger that the Lord had to bring me through, because there was a time when you used to say something and I would blow up in the classroom. There was a time that people say, I know, shocked, right? There was times that I was so angry. There was times, and biblical was actually an environment where I was able to work through a lot of my own anger and a lot of my own shame. The original one, because now I'm finding out the new shame. But learning to allow the Holy Spirit to move and to allow me to have conversations and to help create safe worlds. So my challenge to all of us is allow that Holy Spirit to move. Embrace the feeling, allow the Holy Spirit to move, and then take action. I know for many of you, because some of my close white friends in the safe environment are telling me they are struggling, and because they are in a family that are embrace of our president, and their battle with having to go home and the division now that they feel when they go home, and the lostness and the pain and the struggle. And then some are telling me they're not bringing it up and they're avoiding it. My challenge to you is work through those feelings. And as African Americans, we need to listen. We need to listen that some of you are really struggling and really going through the journey. So I'm excited that you would have allowed me these few minutes to stand before you. And I just want to close with this part when we go to our discussion questions is, because of my own journey of being Black American, middle class, I made a decision to work in this city. I made a decision to sit with the loss, because I realized their generational trauma is deeper than me. I'm an in-home therapist, but I get the pleasure of going into the homes. But part of my journey is I actually take families to restaurants, and I see the stress of a Black American when they walk into an all-white establishment. They may not say it, but they're getting angry, they're getting agitated, and I say, what's going on? I have to, as a therapist, because I know that's what's going on. And so many of my clients, but I had the privilege of living in two worlds. But there's so many people who are in need. I'm going to tell this last story. I'm going to get out your way because we're going to have a questionnaire. Is this? I have a foster son, my brother actually in my house, but anyway, long story short. And he has an advocate from Casca, a white man, about 70 years old, who comes to our meetings. And he meets with him several times a month, but they've been together for months. There's things I can say that Keem never listens to me. But that white man looks him in the eye and says X, Y, and Z, brings him pizza, talks to him, brings him shirts, brings him things. That is beautiful to see this relationship. Because this man's a retired, I think he's an attorney. That retired man who invests in this young man. So we ask, what small things can we do? When 18 to 25-year-olds, African-American males, number one death is really suicide. Most people don't know they're one of the largest population of suicide. Risky behavior, 80% in single homes. I'm telling you, that's systemic. Through DIFUS system, all kind of things. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's not because we're just immoral people. It has a lot to do with the structures that this time to take. So my goal, my hope, that I'm hoping you to see new ways. Come and sit at someone's table. Listen. Small ways take a person out, not just African American, Native American, Hispanic, Latinos, are poor. Spend time, embrace, see, but most of all, let's take actions in small ways. And I hope that transitions into your various cultures and countries as well. Amen. So at your table, we would like for you to spend time asking these questions. Where have you noticed generational trauma in your community and organization? What systems and structures maintain generational trauma in your community? And what can you do to interrupt these systems? Okay, so at your table, would you have this discussion? Thank you. Oh, you have 25 minutes?
No, we,
20.
let's give you about, we'll go with her 12 minutes, and then we'll get feedback.
Okay.
Because there's going to be questions.
Okay. I was on time. So we're going to give you the opportunity to answer the question. Let's just take the first one first. Where have you noticed generational trauma in your community and organization? And what systems and structures maintain these generational trauma in your community? You have the mics, so please step up to the mic. Is there anything?
The church. You come to church, you're supposed to be a certain way, you're supposed to act a certain way. We don't talk about certain things, we don't talk about this, we do it like this, and the place that should be the most obvious place to talk about all these issues is the place where we can't talk about all these issues. And I think that is perpetuated generation after generation after generation.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So the church.
On behalf of my table, I would say the missions movement, many Christian organizations and mission agencies have tokenism on their leadership, token Asian, token whatever, brought in, and I long for the day when, since the missions movement has shifted and the healthiest and most vibrant mission agencies and movements are in other parts of the world, there would be less American domination and more leadership from where it's really happening missions-wide.
I happen to live in Sanford, Florida, which is on your timeline. It's the city where Trayvon Martin was murdered, not too far from where I live. And my family and I chose that community because we love the diversity there. But I want to give you a little bit of hope. What happened in that case, when it finally went to court, before it went to court, the churches, the black churches and the white churches came together as a community. The leadership came together as a community and recognized the responsibility that they had and the place of influence that they could be, the opportunity that they had to influence their communities to counteract the violence that was just below the surface, that just wanted to erupt. And so they worked between the time of the murder and the time of the court, they worked with their community and with their congregations to talk about this and to encourage conversation. And then when the court case happened, and that day in court, when the wrong verdict came down and was so painful and so heinous, the clergy were together, the black and white pastors and priests were in the front row in the courtroom. There, they were present in that place, and so that when that came down outside of the courthouse, there were lots of people, and there was national TV media there, but they were there as a place of peace and as a peacekeeping force, army, an unarmed army. No, it was but it was a beautiful thing to see what can happen, and that's why after that night, there was expected to be huge riots and all kinds of things, and it did not happen. It was quiet. The very next morning, I went out running. I was not afraid because of that, because of what the church had done.
Could you explain what the Trayvon Martin?
Yeah.
Because some people may not know what that was.
Trayvon Martin was, so if you didn't understand, Trayvon Martin was an African-American teen who went to the store, had soda and Skittles in his pocket, and he was shot and killed by a man. And just to make a long story short, the man got off. He never was, the trial was huge, but it showed that he did not get convicted. There's a law of, that he was allowed to carry, and he felt threatened, and so he had the right to kill. And so I put Trayvon Martin, the only one there, but from that, it sparked a lot more investigations of what we already knew was happening, which was a lot of killings of African-American males by police. So I just put that one on there because even though it's not right now in the media, it's still happening. And then yet the police and other people are not being convicted for these shootings. So that's what Trayvon Martin was, and thank you for sharing that story. And so what we heard is that the church should be a place that we can come together and be able to be a force to undo. But instead, it's been a place that's been continuing generational trauma instead of being a place that could be a healing force.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but yet she showed an example where they were a healing force. I'm sorry.
Ça ne donne pas? Ok. Je vais m'exprimer en français. Je me sens à l'aise en français. Je me sens bien en français.
Donc, okay, I feel good speaking in French, so I will express myself in French.
Sur la question, je me sens un peu irrité par rapport au traumatisme générationnel
regarding the
couleur. Je n'aime pas ça.
Tu n'aimes pas ça? De quoi?
Je n'aime pas qu'on parle de traumatisme de couleur, de noir et de blanc. Je n'aime pas cette question.
Okay, so regarding the gentleman who was affected by generational trauma, and I do not like to speak about generational trauma in terms of color, whether black or white. I do not like that topic.
Voilà, c'est bien.
Okay, that's good.
Ce que je veux faire une adaptation.
Is to adapt that story.
Je veux qu'on parle de traumatisme d'injustice.
I wish to speak about the topic of traumas related to injustice.
Il y a injustice partout, de classe économique, de classe sociale.
At all levels, at the economic level, at the social level.
Et ça se trouve partout.
And it is rampant.
Même de la même couleur.
And even within the same color.
Et qu'est-ce qui le maintient?
And what is the factor that maintains it into place?
C'est le concept du pouvoir et de la peur.
It's the concept of power and of fear.
Et qu'est-ce qui peut l'aider à l'interrompre?
What is the power that could help interrupt it?
C'est la valorisation de l'homme.
It's the human valorization.
Nous sommes tous faits à l'image de Dieu.
Nous sommes all made in the image of God.
Si.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, you're totally correct. That it is about power, and it is about. But in America, unfortunately, it has become about race, because of the color of our skins and because of the history of. That's why I gave you the timeline. And unfortunately, it has. But it also, like you're right, it is about power. It is about, because as an African American, I could choose to stay predominantly in the white culture and maintain my monetary power and stay focused on being accepted and not be involved. I cannot be involved in the African American community. That's a choice I can actually, by power, make. Instead, I choose to work with the drug addict and the gang member. I choose to go in their homes. And trust me, there's times I'm unsafe. But there's a choice that you're right, I have a sense of power by the very fact that I am a licensed professional counselor, I have letters behind my name. I walk into social service, and actually as a therapist, believe it or not, I go into a social service situation in order for my client to move forward. I have to get them some economical background, some things I have to do. I walk into, and they'll treat me all because I'm black. They'll say all kind of stuff. As soon as I say, here's my card, the conversation change. I walk into a school system and an IEP meeting, And as soon as I give them my card, the conversation changed. Why? Because I have a sense of power as an African American because of 3 letters behind my name. So yeah, you're right. It's not about black and white. Unfortunately, it's labeled in that sense here. I have white clients, and I'm telling you honest God truth. I have drug addict white clients who've lost their children, and part of what I do is counsel them to regain their kids back, as well as blacks. But I've seen it for myself, how quickly the whites can restore and gain and get jobs, and I can have the black for months with all different more services to get and take them to get jobs, and this one take year 2, this one 3 months. So unfortunately, it still has a race relationship to power and economical injustice, unfortunately, in America. As Carol has made it clear, even for Native Americans, there's this clear divide of being left out in history and left out. And so therefore, the structures itself keeps the maintaining of those historical generational trauma structures. Okay, let's go to question 2. What can you do to interrupt these systems?
So my name's Joy, and I'm a student at Biblical Theological Seminary. And we were talking about this a little bit at our table, that especially if you're a white person, there's a lot of division in even families now, along with your friends and everything else, because race is being elevated as a conversation in our culture with the last election and things like that. And one of our tendencies is to be quiet and to not talk, because it causes a lot of division and it's really uncomfortable. And you know, that's a privilege that we have as white people, to not talk about it and to be willing to make our comfort a higher priority. And I know I struggle with this myself. I don't want to have difficult relationships or be that person at the party who's always, you know, bringing up issues or saying giving the counter view. But I think that one of the ways that these systems get disrupted is by those of us who have the privilege, using our privilege to speak and to say things and to not allow the status quo to go smoothly, if that makes sense, to be a disruptor. And it's uncomfortable, but that's not as uncomfortable as it is to be a minority living in the United States. So I think we have to just remember that, and I have to remember that, because even, you know, like on Facebook, you say a little something, and before you know it, all your friends and family are like saying something to you or pulling you aside and telling you that you're the one causing racism. And to be willing to be labeled a racist by your predominant friends, your dominant culture friends and family, and being willing to, you know, sacrifice even your reputation, if you want to call it that, to be willing to speak out about things that people don't want to hear or don't want to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. Like I said, I struggle with that. My best friend, she's white, and she really struggles with it, so thank you. Of what she has to face when she goes to face her family. So it's really not easy. So I commend you for that. Thank you. A few other tips would be, too, is in small ways, if you have in your church, you can go and ask, what are your police structure? What is your policing around these issues? And find out and participate in asking questions. I hope that you ask through new lenses. What are we doing about immigration and issues, and how? What is sanctuary cities? And there's different ways to be involved in the political structures and undoing things as a church. My friend's church, Mennonite Church, are very active in Philadelphia with the sanctuary city, having dialogues with the whole immigration system. They're, as a church, they are actively involved. They're actually involved with the African American community. They have class on racism, where their Sunday school class read books that have racial, like I think Harriet was telling me about the Church in Lynching. I didn't read that one, right? The Church in Lynching book that she read, and the one, The Warmth of a Sun. Yep, the other sons. I know this particular church actually does that. They actually read these type of books as a part of their Sunday school in order to have a consciousness about the injustices in America. Every year they make a conscious decision to go through things like that. And I think it has to be intentional. and they have speakers, and they have intentional meetings with other churches and people to continue to undo within their community, actively involved. So thank you, and I think Phil may be wrapping up.
Okay. Again, if what we've been talking about this last hour isn't your context, you have the same issues. It just looks different, right? And so it behooves you to ask, who do I need to be talking to? Who do I need to be listening to? Who do I need to be empowering? One of the things that I was thinking about when Carolyn Custis James was delivering her talk was, whoever is narrating the story has the power to tell it, right? And to decide how it will be told. And that goes to even our biblical stories. How do we narrate the biblical story? She talks about the book of Ruth, and she talked about it in a way that might have sounded different than the way you've read about it in commentaries and the way it's been talked about it. Who is narrating the story in your community? Whether it's the Bible story, or the story of your history, the story of resilience, the story of what's wonderful, right? These are the questions. Who else could be telling the story? Who can you give the mic to? And let them tell the story differently and listen to it. You might disagree with it. It might actually not be the most accurate story, but maybe yours isn't either, right? So be thinking about that. So we leave you with this one little thought. Have you ever been in a room with a mosquito, just one, and it keeps you awake all night? Do you think you're too small? Remember the mosquito. You can have an impact.
Jesus, you move toward people who are in pain and have suffered in silence so long that they don't know what it's like to not suffer in silence. And we think of all the military families that are represented in this room, but also not represented in this room. All those who are at home, all those we work with, all those that even just walk the streets and we don't know what their story is. Will you not just see their pain, but help us to see their pain? And will you give us what we need so that we can listen well to them, even when we are disquieted by their stories, and make those stories something that matter to us, and help us to sit with those people, help us to ask the right questions, help us to be attentive to the unique struggles of military families. And we pray for all of the families who are represented in this room, and particularly those who shared today, that you will continue to heal the long road, that long road. Will you keep walking it with them, heal their story, heal their pain, and help them to know that this is a process and a long journey, and that you're with them, and let us be with them as well. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Thanks for sharing. So today our closing activity will be led by Carol Bremer-Bennett, who is with us from World Renew. She's the director of World Renew. Carol has over 20 years of experience in various forms of leadership, but also education, and she has many adopted children, which I learned, and she herself has a beautiful, unique story, and she's here to close us out today, so welcome.
Nate, maybe you can wheel those three over this direction, the ones that have wheels there, so they come here behind me. No, they're over there. I think this is probably good. Tate Carol Bremer-Bennett Yunishe, Tohaglini Nishle, Totachitni Basis Chin. My name is Carol Bremer-Bennett, and I am born for the Water Flows Together people and born to the Bitter Water people. Those are people of the Navajo Nation of the beautiful Southwest. And I know some of you have heard some of the devotions and stories I've shared in previous years. And so it's great to be with you again. This nourishes me. It creates a heaviness in my heart that I was certainly feeling through the last stories here, but it also creates and renews a great hope in me. So it's wonderful to be with you. Yesterday, Dr. Langberg shared with us that we carry the DNA of God's Spirit. I thought that was so beautiful. And I know, actually, I just got a text earlier today. My DNA is over there at Ancestry.com because my husband, for my 50th birthday, decided to give me a gift to find out more. I'm adopted as well as having adopted children. And so I don't know anybody who's related to me through my DNA other than God. And I claim being God's beloved daughter fiercely because that is the one DNA that I know. And it got me to thinking about how in the Navajo tradition, your hands are a symbol of who you come from. They connect you to your ancestors. And so as you look at your hands, notice your hands, and notice that you have you can just maybe look at your right hand. You've got 4 fingers and, of course, a thumb. And it's very complex. I'm going to give you the very simple version of the Navajo part. But you have your maternal grandparents, your paternal grandparents, your mother, and your father all in your hand. So it's like it's like a family tree right there in your hand. And then, of course, you have yourself. And I was thinking of the story of the little girl who lost her thumb in an adoption, really, right? In an adoption process, and how she was lost. She lost herself for a while, and it's only through the love of a Christian woman and taking in that she was able to be restored. And I just thought about that symbolism of your hand. In the Navajo tradition, if you close your hand, close it in a fist, then, of course, these bumps appear, right? We call them knuckles. In the Navajo tradition, those represent the sacred mountains. There are 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo, one, of course, to the east, and to the south, and to the west, and to the north, and they have their own symbolism. But your hand is sacred. It represents your whole family and yourself. It's created by the Creator, and it's a placeholder to think of that sacred place in those sacred mountains. So the very last thing you should ever do with your hand is to hit someone else. That violence. I was thinking about that this morning as we talked about the domestic violence in our world, in our lives, and in our communities, maybe even in our own homes, and how that's such a violation of what God wanted you to be, your family to be. And it got me to thinking about the Bible and how the imagery of the hand and God's hand in the Bible is also very powerful. We could go on and on and on looking and seeing the verses that that the Bible gives us about God's hands. I thought of 2. Psalm 102. Talks about how in the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. I picture God taking, in my mind, the red soil like I find in the Southwest, and forming man, forming woman in his own image. In Isaiah 64, talks even more about God's hand interacting with us. Yet you, Lord, are our Father. We are the clay, and you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. Closed hands can be violent. They can also be selfish. We all know the stories of little kids, or maybe it's raccoons or whatever, who would reach into a jar or something to grab something, and they want it, and they can't get their hand back out because their hand is bigger when it's closed, and you can't squeeze it back out, you know, and they're stuck there even. And so we see those stories, and we realize, you know, we are not called to be people of closed hands. We are called to be people of open hands. Open hands can receive. Open hands can hold many things, good things and hard things. We can hold them both, as my friend Richard Rohr has taught me. We can hold them both at the same time and still know God and be close to God. Open hands can also let go of things that are not good for us to hang on to and clench tightly. And open hands can give. Things can flow through them, and you can give good things to others. Open hands can welcome all of life. Open hands can let go of the hurt. And open hands can receive God's loving healing. Father Thomas Keating, who I heard is somebody's boyfriend in this room yesterday, has the welcoming prayer. And if you look around the room, we have parts of the welcoming. The welcoming prayer has 3 parts to it. First, I welcome. Next, so your hands are open and you welcome. Next, I let go of. And then finally, I open. I open myself. Let me read you Father Thomas Keating's prayer, and then I'm going to give you some time of quiet reflection to think about the last couple of days, to consider your work, and to write your own thoughts of what do you welcome, what do you let go of, and what do you open yourself to. Pray with me. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I welcome everything that comes to me today because I know it's for my healing. I welcome all thoughts, feelings, emotions, persons, situations, and conditions. I let go of my desire for power and control. I let go of my desire for affection, esteem, approval, and pleasure. I let go of my desire for survival and security. I let go of my desire to change any situation, condition, person, or myself. And I open to the love and presence of God and God's action within. Amen. Take a few minutes and reflect on what can you welcome. As hard as it is, the good and the bad, as hard as it may be, what can you welcome? Because God can use even that to bring you closer to Him. And what can you let go of that you've been hanging on to with clenched fist? And in that letting go, what might you open yourself to? Take some time to consider that on your own. If you'd like, I invite you to walk up to one of the boards. There's a welcome and a let go and an open on this side, up here behind me, and also on that side of the room. There's markers, And you can put down a phrase or a prayer that you'd like to share with the group. So why don't you take about 5 minutes now and reflect. Usually a welcoming prayer is used at the beginning, right, of a day. So why don't we think about what you've reflected on, and as you even leave the room today, I still invite you to put